Welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about religion and ethics and how they may or may not relate to one another, and cover at least a couple of the main ways of thinking about this in Western thought. We won't be looking, at least in this talk, about non-Western approaches to ethics, so we'll be emphasizing the Christian tradition, but we might say more generally monotheism. So that would include Christianity and Islam and Judaism. All right, well, let's just begin by talking about two passages from the Christian Bible. One is from what the Christians call the Old Testament, so this will be shared with Jews as well, and then the second from the Christian New Testament. Let's start with the New Testament one first. So this is a famous parable story told by Jesus. And so the story, which is from the Gospel of Luke chapter 10, goes like this. So Luke says, "On one occasion an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he asked, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'What is written in the law?' Jesus replied. 'How do you read it?' He answered, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.' 'You have answered correctly,' Jesus replied. 'Do this and you will live.' But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?' In reply, Jesus said, 'A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" Jesus asked. The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Okay, so this is a passage that is often lifted up by Christians to show how the Bible endorses values that are good to practice, and which is also sometimes argued as a unique source of value. So note in this passage here that the question arises, who is my neighbor? Who ought I to be good to? And the message of the parable seems to suggest that not only to the person who is literally your neighbor next door, but to someone who is on the road, and even someone you might despise. So in the context of the time, Samaritans were people who were in fact despised by other Jews. And so there's this sort of cultural, even racial dynamic going on that's part of the parable. So on the one hand, we see the Bible lifting up values that many of us, whether we're religious or not, see as being exemplary in character. On the other hand, the Bible also presents passages that are at best, we might say, challenging. So a standard example here is the story of the binding of Isaac, or the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures from a Jewish perspective. So this would be the book of Genesis, chapter 22, and so the story goes something like this, that God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, and gives instructions for him to do it. And so if we read further, we read that Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. All right, and then the passage goes on to say how the son is replaced by a ram, and so it ends up that Abraham does not sacrifice his son. Now, this is a passage that generates quite a bit of controversy, because one way to look at this is it's a test of Abraham. The passage itself suggests that. But on the other hand, there is this question, what kind of test is this? What kind of God would ask someone to sacrifice their own child to prove loyalty to God? And so critics of religion point to this as saying, well, religion inspires actually practices that are not so good. Religion, some would say, encourages violence. Practices that are unethical. All right, so these are some of the dynamics that get played out when you start talking about religion and ethics. So, let's take two traditional claims. One traditional claim is this, that if you are religious, you might be inclined to argue that religion is a motivation to be ethical, and in fact, religion is really the only motivation to be ethical. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. Nothing is forbidden. Anything goes. And so what we need, says the religious person, is we need those guidelines from God to tell us what's right and wrong. So that's one kind of traditional claim. We might call that the traditional religious claim. On the other hand, the traditional anti-religious claim is quite the opposite. Religion makes people unethical. There's a famous quote to the effect that it takes religion to make good people do bad things. And we can see at least instances of that in history, and we can point to places where religion does this. In the history of Christianity, we might point to the Crusades. In Islam, we might point to at least radical versions of Islam that encourage suicide bombers. But even if we look at Hinduism and Buddhism, we can find instances of practices that are encouraged by religion that we may find morally problematic. So, which is it? Or is it, we might ask, either one? Now, we might note one aspect of that first claim, the religious claim. Sometimes it's claimed that religion motivates people to be ethical because religion provides a guarantee of an afterlife, and indeed the possibilities of eternal punishment or eternal damnation. And this certainly could be the case, although this does run the risk of reducing ethics to egoism, except it's from a religious perspective. So recall when we talked about egoism is the view one should always just do what's in one's own self-interest. And of course, if it's in one's own self-interest to live eternally in paradise, then that's why I should act ethically in that sense. But even from a religious perspective, it seems like ethics requires more than this, that the bulwark that religion is said to provide ethics is not simply to provide motivation in that egoistic sense, but to lift up the spirit, might say, to something better than what we already are. If we look at that second claim, we might also note there's a problem. And certainly we can point to instances in history where religion encourages people to do bad things. But we can also point to instances in history where religion encourages people to do good things as well. If we look at individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, all three of those people are deeply religious individuals, different in their religious beliefs, but nevertheless their religion inspired them to do good things for others. Okay, now those are some observations, and at least not only of descriptive observations, but observations of some standard accounts. When philosophers get into the act, there's a really two primary ways of thinking about how religion might be said to justify ethics, and some others as well, but we're going to look mainly just at the two primary ones. Okay, so the first of these is referred to as divine command theory, or just the principle of divine command. And so the argument goes like this, that what is good is simply what God tells us is good. Okay, so if you are a Christian, or Jewish in this case, you might point to, for instance, the Ten Commandments. Right? So in the traditional biblical account, Moses goes up the mountain, comes back down with the Ten Commandments, and in the Ten Commandments are principles like do not lie, do not steal, do not commit adultery. And it's because God gave us those commandments that those are things that we're not supposed to do. The only reason we know what is good and what is bad is based on divine commands, usually understood to be transmitted through revelation, which usually is taken to mean through the Bible or some holy text. So if you're a Christian, it'd be the Bible. If you're Jewish, it'd be specifically the Torah, and maybe also the Talmud. If you're Muslim, it'd be instead the Quran, along with the Hadith. So, this would be one way of thinking about it. This is a very simple way, and it's also a very clear way of thinking about ethics. In addition, it's universal in scope. Right? So this appeals to that intuition that ethics has this universal character, that ethical laws are true everywhere and for everyone. If adultery is wrong for me, it's also wrong for you, and it's also wrong for people living in other countries. So, there's a certain kind of appeal there. On the other hand, it does raise certain kinds of issues. One of the standard issues, actually a very basic issue it raises, was one that was noticed already by the philosopher Socrates and his student Plato already in the 300s, 400s BCE. And this was noticed in a work, or at least written down in a work called the Euthyphro.